What if I told you that history's most powerful psychological reversal happened not on a battlefield, but in a courtroom? A carpenter from Nazareth walked in as the accused, facing execution for treason against Rome. But through 3 calculated psychological strategies, he didn't just escape judgment, he became the judge of his accusers. Within 3 centuries, the same empire that crucified him would bow before his teachings. How does someone transform from defendant to judge of the most powerful empire in history? The answer lies in 3 psychological weapons that changed the course of human civilization forever. If you're building influence or leading others, the most powerful psychological methods in history were hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. What you're about to discover will change everything you know about power. Most people think Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate was simply about religious persecution. They see a helpless victim facing an inevitable death sentence from an all-powerful Roman governor. But this surface-level understanding misses the most sophisticated psychological chess match in recorded history. Here's what doesn't make sense. Pilate had the absolute power of life and death. He could execute anyone without explanation. Roman governors regularly crucified thousands without a second thought. Yet in the gospel accounts, we see something unprecedented. A Roman governor desperately trying not to execute his prisoner. Pilate washes his hands. He offers to release a prisoner. He questions Jesus repeatedly, looking for any excuse to set him free. He even declares publicly, "I find no fault in this man." Why would the representative of Rome's unlimited power suddenly become so hesitant? Why did the most decisive military machine in history start second-guessing itself when faced with one unarmed carpenter? The traditional narrative paints Jesus as powerless in this moment, but psychological analysis reveals something far more strategic. Every response, every silence, every word was calculated to achieve something revolutionary, transforming the power dynamic from the inside out. Consider this. Jesus had been preparing for this moment his entire ministry. He knew he would face Roman authority. He understood the psychology of power, and he walked into that courtroom not as a victim, but as someone executing the first phase of history's most audacious psychological strategy. Most people see Pilate as holding all the cards. But what if the carpenter from Nazareth was actually controlling the entire game? What if his apparent weakness was his greatest weapon? The first psychological strategy reveals how silence became more powerful than any army. This wasn't just about religious faith. This was about understanding power at its deepest level and knowing exactly how to dismantle it from within. The man standing trial wasn't just facing judgment. He was preparing to reverse it completely. The question isn't how Jesus survived this encounter. It's how he managed to make his judge become his first convert to a new understanding of authority itself. The first psychological strategy Jesus deployed was what modern psychology calls strategic silence, but with a twist that would make Machiavelli jealous. This wasn't passive resistance. It was active psychological warfare. When Pilate questioned him, Jesus' selective responses created something psychologists call cognitive dissonance in his interrogator. Pilate expected either desperate pleas for mercy or defiant challenges to Roman authority. Instead, he got calculated silence that forced the Roman governor to fill the void with his own doubts. Historical records show Pilate was already psychologically vulnerable. He'd faced multiple complaints to Rome about his harsh governance. His position was precarious. He needed this trial to demonstrate Roman control, not create more problems. Jesus understood this perfectly. But here's the genius. Jesus spoke precisely when his words would create maximum psychological impact and stayed silent when silence would be more powerful. When Pilate asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus responded, "You have said so." This wasn't evasion, it was psychological jujitsu, turning Pilate's authority back on itself. The strategic silence continued throughout the interrogation. Ancient Roman trials were public spectacles designed to showcase imperial power. Defendants were expected to grovel, deny, or rage against their fate. Jesus did none of these. His composure in the face of ultimate earthly power created an unsettling atmosphere that rippled threw everyone present. Pilate's wife even sent a message warning him to have nothing to do with this righteous man because of troubling dreams. The psychological pressure was building from multiple directions, all orchestrated by Jesus' strategic responses. The brilliance becomes clear when you realize Jesus wasn't playing defense, he was playing offense. Every moment of silence was calculated to make Pilate question not just this specific case, but the entire foundation of power itself. The Roman system depended on fear and intimidation. Jesus' fearlessness in the face of death began dismantling that system psychologically. Modern neuroscience shows us that when people encounter someone who doesn't react to power in expected ways, it creates profound psychological uncertainty. Pilate began questioning everything: his authority, his judgment, even reality itself. By the end of the interrogation, the roles had reversed. Pilate was the one desperately seeking answers, while Jesus maintained complete psychological control. The defendant had become the silent judge of his judge. Think of strategic silence like a psychological mirror. When someone holds up a perfect mirror to you, you don't see the mirror. You see yourself. Jesus turned himself into a psychological mirror for Pilate, reflecting back all the Roman governor's fears, doubts, and insecurities. Pilate looked at this silent prisoner and saw not a threat to Rome, but a reflection of everything wrong with his own position. The silence forced him to confront questions he'd been avoiding. What if power based on fear isn't real power? What if true authority comes from something deeper than violence? This is why strategic silence is so devastating in any power dynamic. When you refuse to play the expected role, whether as a victim, an enemy, or a supplicant, you force the other person to examine their own assumptions about power itself. Jesus understood that real authority doesn't announce itself or defend itself. It simply exists. By embodying this principle, he demonstrated a form of power that Roman force couldn't touch or understand. The governor of Judea, surrounded by all the symbols of imperial might, suddenly felt powerless in the presence of someone who truly didn't fear death. The psychological impact extended beyond Pilate. Every Roman soldier, every Jewish leader, every observer in that courtroom witnessed something unprecedented. Earthly power becoming nervous and uncertain when confronted with a different kind of authority entirely. This strategic silence planted seeds that would grow over the following decades. Those who witnessed it would remember that moment when the most powerful empire on earth seemed to tremble before one unarmed man who simply refused to be afraid. But strategic silence was only the beginning. The second psychological strategy would prove even more revolutionary, turning apparent defeat into ultimate victory through the power of symbolic transformation. If this is exploding your mind, stop now and hit the subscribe button. Why? Because what comes next will explode your understanding of psychological power, and if you don't subscribe, the algorithm will hide my next secrets from you. The second psychological strategy is even more audacious than the first. While strategic silence dismantled Pilate's confidence, Jesus' next move would transform the meaning of defeat itself. He took the Roman Empire's most shameful form of execution and turned it into the ultimate symbol of victory. Here's what makes no sense from a conventional power perspective. Crucifixion was specifically designed to be the most humiliating death possible. Romans reserved it for slaves, rebels, and the lowest criminals. It was meant to serve as a psychological weapon, a public display of what happened to anyone who challenged imperial authority. The cross was Rome's statement: this is what happens when you oppose us. It was meant to inspire terror, hopelessness, and complete submission to Roman power. For 3 centuries, it had been completely effective. No one had ever successfully challenged the psychological impact of Roman crucifixion. But Jesus saw something the Romans missed entirely. He understood that symbols derive their power not from their original intended meaning, but from how people choose to interpret them. And he was about to perform the greatest symbolic reversal in human history. Consider the psychological brilliance. Instead of trying to avoid the cross or minimize its significance, Jesus embraced it completely. He talked about it openly during his ministry. He prepared his followers for it. He walked toward it willingly. This wasn't resignation. It was strategic transformation of meaning. The Romans thought they were destroying him with their ultimate weapon of psychological control. But Jesus was preparing to seize that weapon and turn it against the empire itself. He understood something about human psychology that would prove more powerful than all of Rome's legions combined. The key insight: people are drawn to symbols of sacrifice more than symbols of domination. Deep in human psychology is a recognition that those who willingly suffer for others possess a moral authority that cannot be conquered by force. Jesus knew that by transforming the cross from a symbol of Roman power into a symbol of sacrificial love, he would create something psychologically unstoppable. The empire's greatest weapon of control would become the foundation of its eventual conversion. This wasn't just about religious symbolism. This was about understanding how human minds process meaning, authority, and power at the deepest level. The second psychological strategy was symbolic inversion, the complete transformation of defeat into victory through reframing meaning. Jesus didn't just endure crucifixion. He strategically transformed it into the ultimate demonstration of a new kind of power. Every detail was psychologically calculated. Instead of dying as a victim, he died as someone making a conscious choice. His final words weren't cries of despair, but statements of completion. It is finished. Not "I am finished," but "it is finished," suggesting he had accomplished exactly what he intended. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The Roman centurion overseeing the execution declared, "Truly this man was the Son of God." A professional soldier, trained to see crucifixion as routine state violence, witnessed something that shattered his understanding of power itself. But the real genius appeared in the following months and years. Instead of the crucifixion serving as a warning against opposing Rome, it became a rallying symbol for a movement that would eventually convert the entire empire. The cross transformed from Rome's weapon of psychological control into Christianity's symbol of victory over death itself. Modern psychology reveals why this strategy was so effective. Humans are neurologically wired to respond more powerfully to narratives of sacrificial courage than displays of brute force. Mirror neurons fire more intensely when we observe someone choosing to suffer for others than when we see someone simply dominating through violence. Jesus understood this psychological principle centuries before science could explain it. He recognized that sustainable authority comes from moral credibility, not physical power. And he chose to demonstrate this principle in the most dramatic way possible, by transforming history's most shameful death into its most honored symbol. The Romans unknowingly provided the perfect stage for this transformation. Their empire was built on the psychology of fear and domination, but Jesus introduced a competing psychology based on love and sacrifice. When people had to choose between these competing narratives, the sacrificial one proved more compelling than the dominative one. Within 3 centuries, the descendants of those who crucified Jesus would be carrying crosses as symbols of ultimate authority. The empire that perfected crucifixion as psychological warfare would be defeated by someone who transformed that very weapon into something completely different. This wasn't supernatural intervention. It was sophisticated psychological strategy executed with perfect precision. Imagine you're in a chess match where your opponent thinks they've just delivered checkmate. But instead of surrendering, you reveal that their winning move was actually the final piece of your strategy all along. That's exactly what Jesus did with the crucifixion. The Romans thought the cross was their ultimate checkmate, a move that would end any challenge to their authority permanently. But Jesus had been preparing for this defeat throughout his entire ministry, knowing it would actually be his victory condition. This is the power of symbolic inversion. When you can transform your opponent's greatest strength into your own weapon, you've achieved something more powerful than conventional victory. You've changed the rules of the game itself. Every dictator throughout history has understood that controlling symbols means controlling people's minds. The Romans were masters of this. Their eagles, their crosses, their architectural monuments all served to psychologically reinforce imperial dominance. But Jesus performed the ultimate symbol hack. He took Rome's most potent psychological weapon and completely rewrote its meaning. Instead of representing Roman power, the cross became the symbol of something that could conquer Rome itself. This strategy works in any power dynamic. When you can take what your opponent considers their strength and transform it into your advantage, you've achieved psychological victory regardless of apparent outcomes. The cross became Christianity's ultimate marketing symbol, not despite being associated with Roman execution, but because of it. It represented someone who had faced the worst earthly power could deliver and transformed it into triumph. Over the following centuries, every time a Roman citizen saw a cross, instead of thinking, "Fear the empire," they would think, "Remember the carpenter who conquered death." The symbol that was meant to reinforce submission became the symbol that inspired conversion. This symbolic transformation created psychological momentum that no amount of Roman military force could stop. Ideas backed by powerful symbols spread faster than armies can march. The second strategy had turned defeat into victory. But the third strategy would prove most revolutionary of all, transforming followers into rulers of the very system that had tried to destroy their leader. If you're watching this far, you are different from most people. Prove it. Leave your like now and subscribe, because people like you deserve to know all the secrets I'll reveal in upcoming videos. The third and most sophisticated psychological strategy is the crown, jewel of Jesus' transformation from defendant to judge. While the first two strategies dismantled Roman confidence and transformed symbols of defeat, the third strategy accomplished something unprecedented. It turned his followers into the psychological inheritors of imperial authority itself. Here's the mystery that historians still struggle to explain. Within 3 centuries of crucifying Jesus, the Roman Empire had not only legalized Christianity, but made it the official state religion. The same governmental system that had executed him as a criminal eventually declared him divine and built the world's greatest churches in his honor. This isn't just ironic. It's psychologically impossible according to conventional understanding of power. Empires don't typically adopt the religions of people they execute for treason. Military cultures don't usually embrace philosophies of peace and forgiveness. Political systems built on domination don't normally convert to ideologies of service and sacrifice. Yet that's exactly what happened. And it wasn't through military conquest or political revolution. The Roman Empire converted from within, through psychological processes that Jesus had set in motion during his trial and crucifixion. The key question: how do you defeat a system from the inside when you're no longer alive to lead the effort? How do you program a psychological virus that will spread through the very power structure that destroyed you? Jesus' answer was the most sophisticated long-term psychological strategy in recorded history. He created what modern psychology calls mimetic programming, self-replicating ideas that would spread through Roman culture and gradually transform it from the inside out. But this wasn't random cultural influence. Every element was strategically designed to appeal to specific psychological vulnerabilities within Roman imperial culture. Jesus had studied the empire's strengths and weaknesses, and he programmed his movement to exploit those weaknesses while providing superior alternatives to Roman strengths. The Romans prided themselves on law and order, but their system was ultimately based on violence and fear. Jesus offered law and order based on love and voluntary cooperation, a psychologically superior foundation that would prove more stable over time. Roman culture valued strength and honor, but defined both through domination of others. Jesus redefined strength and honor through service and sacrifice, definitions that would prove more sustainable and appealing to human nature. Most importantly, Jesus understood that lasting change happens through transformed individuals, not imposed systems. The third psychological strategy was institutional infiltration through value transformation, the systematic replacement of Roman cultural values with Christian principles, executed through individual conversion rather than political revolution. Jesus understood something that political revolutionaries throughout history have missed. You can't defeat a system by attacking it from outside. You defeat it by offering something psychologically superior and letting it spread through the system organically. He created a value system that was more psychologically satisfying than Roman imperial culture, and then programmed it to spread through existing social networks. The genius was in the targeting. Jesus didn't try to convert Roman elites directly. That would have triggered immediate systematic resistance. Instead, he focused on psychological principles that would naturally appeal to people throughout the social hierarchy. Slaves seeking dignity, women seeking equality, soldiers seeking purpose beyond violence, merchants seeking honest business practices, administrators seeking justice beyond personal advantage. Each group found something in Christian teaching that addressed their specific psychological needs better than Roman culture could. The slave discovered inherent human worth. The woman found equality before God. The soldier found honor through protection rather than conquest. The merchant found prosperity through honest dealing. The administrator found power through service. But here's where the strategy becomes truly sophisticated. These converted individuals didn't abandon their positions within Roman society. They remained slaves, women, soldiers, merchants, and administrators, but they began operating according to Christian rather than Roman psychological principles. This created what psychologists call systemic cognitive dissonance throughout the empire. Roman institutions continued functioning, but the people within them were increasingly operating according to non-Roman values. The system began changing from within without any coordinated external attack. The conversion of Constantine in 312 AD wasn't the cause of Christianity's victory over Rome. It was the inevitable result of 3 centuries of psychological infiltration. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity, Roman culture had already been substantially transformed. He was simply acknowledging what had already happened psychologically. The most brilliant aspect, Jesus programmed this transformation to be self-sustaining and self-expanding. Each person converted according to Christian values became a catalyst for converting others, not through formal evangelism, but through demonstrating superior psychological frameworks for living. Within 4 centuries, the empire that had crucified Jesus was building massive cathedrals in his honor and sending missionaries to spread his teachings throughout the known world. Think of this strategy like a psychological virus designed to improve its host. Unlike biological viruses that damage their hosts, Jesus created a beneficial virus that made infected individuals and institutions healthier, more stable, and more attractive to others. When Roman citizens encountered Christians who were happier, more ethical, more community-minded, and more psychologically resilient than typical Romans, they naturally wanted to understand the source of these superior qualities. The virus spread not through force or deception, but through genuine psychological improvement. This is why Christianity succeeded where other reform movements failed. It didn't attack Roman culture directly. It offered superior alternatives that people naturally preferred once they experienced them. Imagine trying to convince people to abandon their favorite restaurant. If you criticized their choice, they'd defend it. But if you invited them to experience a restaurant with better food, better service, and better atmosphere, they'd naturally make the switch themselves. Jesus understood that sustainable change happens through attraction, not promotion or attack. He created a psychological framework so superior to Roman imperial culture that people naturally gravitated toward it once they experienced it firsthand. The transformation of individual Romans led to transformation of Roman institutions, which led to transformation of Roman culture, which led to transformation of the Roman Empire itself, all without a single military campaign against Rome. By the time Roman leaders realized what was happening, the transformation was irreversible. The empire had been psychologically conquered from within by the very person they thought they had defeated through crucifixion. The carpenter who had stood trial as a defendant had become the ultimate judge of Roman civilization itself. His psychological strategies had successfully transformed the mightiest empire in history into the vehicle for spreading his teachings throughout the world. This wasn't just religious conversion, it was the most sophisticated example of psychological warfare in human history. 3 simple strategies had accomplished what no military force had ever achieved: the complete transformation of Roman imperial culture from within. These 3 psychological strategies, strategic silence, symbolic inversion, and institutional infiltration through value transformation, didn't just transform one man from defendant to judge. They transformed human civilization itself. The carpenter from Nazareth understood power at levels that empire builders never grasped. Real authority comes from psychological superiority, not physical force. By the time Rome realized they weren't executing a criminal, but creating a psychological revolution, it was too late. The defendant had become judge of the very system that condemned him. And that judgment would reshape the world for 2 millennia to come. If these secrets exploded your mind, you need to see my next videos, but only if you hit the bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the most powerful secrets in history. What's your opinion about the ideas presented in this content? Leave it in the comments. Send this revelation to that friend who has sharp perception. This analysis is speculative and based on historical and psychological interpretation of publicly available information, not clinical diagnosis.